Hello, my name's David Keller. I'm very pleased to be with you today to talk about military prisons of the Civil War. If you look on the screen, there are two interesting quotes. One from Winston Churchill: "A prisoner of war is a man who tries to kill you and fails and then asks you not to kill him." Winston Churchill certainly had a right to talk about prisoners. He was a prisoner of war himself during the Boer Wars of 1899. He was a prisoner in November and later escaped in December of that year. On the bottom is a quote by Karl von Clausewitz, who probably wrote the definitive work on 19th century military action. "Artillery and prisoners are all at all times regarded as the true trophies of victory." Interesting, he sort of looks upon the prisoner as no different than a piece of artillery. What I want to do is talk about some factors that made the Civil War prisons what they were. Actually, this study is based on work I did with the Andersonville National Site POW Research Program, who funded two studies for me to look at factors that resulted in conditions at the prison camps. What is typical and traditionally talked about when you talk about military prisons are the following: poor sanitation conditions, weather conditions, inadequate clothing and shelter, poor quality and quantity of food, primitive medical care, brutal guards, and the condition of the prisoners upon arrival. These are very typical of what we discuss on why the conditions in prison camps were so poor. But what I want to do is look behind these conditions at factors that contributed greatly to that on the part of both the Confederates and the Union. When I did the study for the Andersonville site, I did it based on some information I received in researching for my book on Camp Douglas. I then studied Union prisons to determine whether these five factors applied, found they did, received another grant to look at Confederate prisons, and found that these factors also contributed in the Confederacy. The factors are a lack of a strategic plan for prison development. Secondly, inadequate plans for long-term incarceration. Third, poor selection and training of camp commanders, lack of training of camp guards, and finally, a failure to provide soldiers information on how to behave as prisoners. These five factors are not developed or discussed to put blame on anyone. There's plenty of blame to go around for conditions. It's really much more to look at factors that perhaps were outside either the thought of the 19th century mind or the need as defined by the leaders. But first, let's look at the strategic plan or lack of it. Number one, the magnitude of the problem. This is really stark. Over 430,000 total prisoners were held during the Civil War, virtually equal between Union and Confederates, a huge number. Compare that to less than 150,000 Americans held as POWs in World War I through the Vietnam War. This magnitude is absolutely stunning and had a huge impact on prisoners during the Civil War. The other factor was few prisoners were held before the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, the fate of prisoners was either death, slavery, ransom, or parole. The circumstances were mobile armies prior to the Civil War had neither logistics support or nor manpower support to handle prisoners of war. Rather, the extensive use of parole and exchange was the easy way and a convenient way, an effective way to handle captive prisoners. Under the parole, the captive signed a document that said, I will not re-enter or fight anymore in this war until I am properly exchanged for a soldier from the other side. This was very effective. The commanders of mobile armies didn't have to worry about the prisoners, signed the parole, turned them loose, and off they went. But what happened? What changes affected the handling of prisoners? Number one, parole took an excessive amount of time to process each prisoner, to develop a document for that prisoner to sign, to identify them, to document them for future discussion. Took a lot of time. We'll talk a little more about that. And second was technological changes. In the United States, the development of the river and the rail transportation system made a huge impact on military technology in general and the movement of potential prisoners. But let's first look at the excessive time question. Example, Harper's Ferry. 12,000 Union prisoners surrendered September 15th, 1862 to Stonewall Jackson. They were to be paroled in place. A.P. Hill and his division were left behind at Harper's Ferry to administer the parole. They marched roughly 17 miles on a forced march, arriving at Sharpsburg the afternoon of September 17th, barely in time to protect Lee's right flank. Had they been later, or had General Burnside been more efficient and got to the road at Sharpsburg sooner, the impact of the lack of Hill could have significantly changed the Battle of Antietam. Let's look at the other side, Vicksburg. 12,000 Confederates surrendered July 4th, 1863. Well, General Grant, who had been in a static position for some time, so he had the ability to handle these paroles without any particular pressure. There was no one pressuring him. He could sit at Vicksburg really as long as he wanted to. So there was a great deal of difference in handling paroles and a lot of pressure. Well, I mentioned the technological changes. Railroads, for example. This slide on the left shows 1850 railroads. There were about 3,000 miles of railroad in 1840 and about 9,000 by 1850. Go forward from 50 to 1850, 1860, there was a huge increase in rail, as you can see the other slide, as well as an organization, particularly in the North, of locally organized railroads into a network. At the beginning of the Civil War, there were roughly 30,000 miles of rail, of which 23,000 were in the North and about 10,000 in the South. But you will notice in the South, where much of the fighting took place, there was pretty good transportation, rail transportation, particularly North and South. In addition to the rail, river transportation had a dramatic change. In roughly 1830, the steamboat came into existence. The steamboat replaced the keel boats and significantly increased the capability of moving troops and supplies in large numbers. Also in the 1830s, a significant amount of effort was made by the U.S. Corps of Engineers to improve the water system. Therefore, the water system, particularly in the moving through the Midwest, became very effective. The final technological change that impacted uh, that impacted the Civil War in 1851 was the development of the telegraph. Well, so you've had some significant changes, and let's see what happened in that lack of a strategic plan from the Confederate perspective. As the war started, the Confederates' priority was to develop uh, their own military. They started from scratch. Their concerns about prisoners was well down on the priority list, and yet they had the first major need to handle prisoners of war, the Battle of Manassas. Prior to Manassas, there had been some captures of prisoners. Most of those prisoners were paroled in place, and a few were sent to prisons, local prisons in the South and as well as in the North. In the North, there were some small prisons in New York, Delaware, but they handled relatively few. But with this significant need, now there was a problem. General Beauregard had no intention of paroling these prisoners. He had a mobile army that was quite disorganized in the early days of the war. He was most interested in trying to pursue the Union. He happened to be at Manassas Junction where there was a railroad. What did he do? He put 1,200 prisoners on a train and sent them to Richmond. Well, in Richmond, the Confederate government looked and said, well, we've got to handle some prisoners. Let's assign that to our provost marshal, Brigadier General John Winder, who, as in June of 1861, became the provost marshal of Richmond. Now, Richmond, the new capital, was growing rapidly. There were office seekers coming. The government was being formed. There were refugees from border states coming. And Winder had a huge job just policing Richmond. He was then given responsibility for the prisoners as an additional duty. As a matter of fact, he was not named as the commissary of prisoners until November 1864. Up to that time, he had dual responsibilities, the primary of which was the provost um, of Richmond. He received virtually nothing in writing as to his authority. And ultimately, the authority and plans of the Confederacy were never codified into a document. They were spread through a number of orders and comments and writings. So there was never a cohesive plan on what they were going to do with their prisoners. Well, what did he do? The first thing he did, he said, well, I'm a cop. I'll put them in jails. Well, the jails space didn't last very long. So he suddenly had a requirement to find space. He chose to select warehouses and factories, mostly abandoned, as prison facilities. And here are pictures of two. Um, Libby Prison, one of the very large prisons, and Camp Thunder. These were abandoned buildings, were a little bit unusual because they were relatively large. Most of the others were much smaller. But these facilities raised a whole series of problems for the Confederacy. One, there was generally no water to the facilities to handle sanitation and drinking and cooking. Second, there were no cooking facilities. They had to be created. There were no sanitation facilities, or certainly not sufficient ones to support. Latrines were often built outside, causing escape problems, or resulted in providing merely buckets in the corner. Well, you can see in these buildings, the ventilation looked pretty good. Many didn't have good ventilation, and these, as a matter of fact, main problems were lack of covering of ventilation during inclement weather. So a whole series of problems. What resulted in the Confederacy was a large number of small facilities, not nearly as large as Union. This resulted in some problems for commanders, which we'll talk about a little bit later. They were basically centralized in Richmond, basically that same style of using abandoned facilities, abandoned buildings, was typical of the Confederacy as they had to move out of Richmond. Let's look at the Union. The Union early on assigned two professionals to handle the prison situation. Brigadier General Montgomery Meigs, Quartermaster General of the United States Army, was overall responsible for handling prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel, later Colonel William Hoffman, was the commissary of prisons assigned in early 1861, which gave him responsibility overall for handling the prisoners. This dual kind of responsibility really improved communications and could have and may have improved facilities for prisoners over time. But let's look at the guideline, the timeline for the Union. Meigs, interestingly, in June of 1861, identified to the Secretary of War that they were going to have to deal with prisoners. This was unheard of in the 19th century military, but Meigs identified this need very early, which led to the assignment of Hoffman in October of 1861 as the commissary of prisons. He maintained that position throughout the Civil War. The first need of the Union of any size came at Fort Donelson in February 1862, when 12,460 prisoners were were captured. General Grant at Fort Donelson told the prisoners they could take anything they had with them except their weapons, put them on unheated boats, sent them up the river system to Paducah, Kentucky, and Cairo, Illinois, and some to St. Louis, Missouri, to further be transported by train to prison camps. Hoffman's responsibility became in writing in June of 1862, so the need to have facilities for in February 1862 fell upon the commander in the West, who was General Halleck. The actual handling of prisoners and conduct of prisoner conditions, was not documented until April of 1863, when General Order 100 was issued. This talked about the responsibility on how you should handle prisoners. So this was the Union approach to the lack of a strategic plan, some action fairly quickly. As I mentioned, when Donelson fell, responsibility fell to Halleck to find houses for them. Along with Colonel Hoffman, he chose to use mustering in facilities available to the prisoners. These mustering in facilities were built for soldiers and were now somewhat underutilized because the vast majority of the regimental sized recruiting was complete. Good example is Camp Chase in Ohio, and Columbus, Ohio is shown here. The typical buildings that Union soldiers had been housed in would be used as housing for the Confederates. When they couldn't use existing mustering in facilities, the Union selected facilities that were close to existing facilities. Point Lookout, Maryland, for example, was a large hospital complex with a prison located near it. These facilities were much larger and were certainly superior to the Confederates in that they were really designed to hold soldiers. Let's then look at the inadequate plans for long-term incarceration. There they had a plan to house these prisoners, both the Confederates and the Union, and they were ultimately held to conditions spelled out in the Dix Hill Cartel in July 1862. This cartel addressed the parole and exchange of prisoners. It didn't really discuss how to treat the prisoners, but merely the parole and exchange. Under the Dix Hill Cartel, one of the bases of the cartel was that prisoners would be paroled within 10 days of capture. This obviously could be effective on on-site paroles, such as Harper's Ferry and uh, other locations. However, once the prisoners were sent to prison camps, the 10 days became a real problem. Uh, However, this 10 days was used, particularly by the Union, to defer improvements to their camps, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. There were prisoner exchanges in September of 1862 and April of 1863. Virtually all of the prisoners in prison camps, both the Union and Confederate, were exchanged. At the time, the only people remaining in the camps were too ill to transfer, and as a matter of fact, command of the Union camps was turned over generally to junior officers, captains, and lieutenants. So the exchange of prisoners was working until mid-1863, when President Lincoln suspended the exchange of prisoners. His suspension of the exchange was based on the position taken by Jefferson Davis that colored troops who were captured would not be treated as captured prisoners, but would be treated as escaped slaves. Lincoln, upon this, determined that he would not exchange any prisoners as long as those conditions were in existence, and they remained in existence until the end of the war. So this then changed the whole need for both the Union and the Confederates. They were going to have prisoners. And as we talked earlier, you can see as that huge number developed, the problems for the Union and the Confederates increased dramatically. Let's look at what the Confederacy did. The Confederacy ran out of hard buildings and became to use the barren stockade much more consistently. This picture shows Columbia, South Carolina, which was basically an open field, and Belle Isle, Virginia, which was a cleared island. In most of these cases in the Confederacy, housing for the prisoners either was non-existent or was tents that might be available. Here you can see the typical tents that were on Belle Isle. Other facilities were very, very primitive and caused great deal of problems. One was Camp Ford, Texas, and the other, of course, the infamous Andersonville, Georgia. Camp
David,
Ford, Texas, interestingly, was a pretty effective camp initially. It was large enough to handle a good number of prisoners, and it also was heavily wooded, which provided shelter for the prisoners. However, the prisoners had to cut down most of the woods to make housing for themselves, and as a result, it became a bare facility, um, open to the terrors of the weather in Texas. Andersonville, of course, is famous as the other one. There was an open field. Now, ironically, Andersonville was the only Confederate prison that was planned. It was planned. The site was selected as a perfect place for a prison camp, very near a rail station in Andersonville. Had very good running water. This is Sweetwater Creek running through it. Somehow the latrines got built right next to it. That sweet water became not very sweet very quickly as uh, the trash from both the Confederates and the Union um, expanded. Now, interestingly, this camp was built in the middle of a forest, and yet there was no lumber provided for shelter for the inmates. Part of it was the local sawmills refused to sell lumber to the Confederates for the price they were willing to pay. And for some reason, the Confederate refused to allow parties of prisoners to go outside the camp to cut wood. If you go to Andersonville today, as it was then, it's absolutely surrounded by virgin forest. Why the Confederates didn't allow cutting of wood by prisoners is unknown. Part of it might have been a result of a lack of guards to provide security. But nonetheless, it ended up a barren facility. Let's look at the unions. What did the union do as they suddenly this inadequate plan and the need for long-term incarceration? Well, they continued to use wherever possible existing facilities. Rock Island, for example, shown on the right here, had handled prisoners since 1861, but the population would be reduced and increased and reduced. It then became a necessity to use it in a large capacity. Elmira, New York is an interesting facility, as shown here. Elmira, New York actually became a prison in 1864, primarily to relieve overcrowding at Point Lookout, Maryland. What I find ironic about it, Elmira, New York had the highest death rate of any Union prison. And here was a prison built in a mustering in facility, almost 2 full years after these facilities had been used, and yet apparently the Union learned nothing from their experience before, and the death rate was astronomical at Elmira. The other things you look at, and Camp Douglas, Illinois, is a good example. Colonel Hoffman, from the time it was organized until the exchange was suspended in 1863, used the 10-day parole factor as a reason not to do things. When a camp commander said, I need better water facilities, well, they're only going to be there 10 days. We don't need to do anything. How about building a sewer? No, we don't need a sewer. They're not going to be there very long. Well, the buildings are falling apart. Oh, don't worry about it. We'll worry about it later. They're not going to be there long. By the time the long-term incarceration became a fact, it was too little, too late to help the prisoners. On the right, Johnson's Island is an example of what could have been done. Johnson's Island was fully planned by General Hoffman. Johnson's Island was an island near Sandusky, Ohio, in Lake Erie. Was planned from dirt to roof by Hoffman. Hoffman even personally trained the guard force. Now, Johnson's Island held almost exclusively Confederate prisoners, but it had certainly one of the lowest death rates of any prison camp in either the North or the South. Had others been planned like this, conditions could have been substantially different. But you can see the problems that developed because of inadequately planning. Both the Union and the Confederacy were chasing each other to try to upgrade and update what they had for prisoners. And the huge numbers made the problem even more significant. Let's now look at the selection and training of camp commanders as a factor. This was interesting because shown on the left there, Brigadier General Jacob Amon was a brigadier general, and similar to most of the camps in the North, they were commanded by senior officers, brigadier generals or full colonels. By contrast, the South camps were commanded by junior officers, captains, lieutenants. Lieutenant Wirz, of course, the infamous commander of Andersonville. What impact did this have? Well, first of all, the senior commanders certainly had a lot of influence. They had a great deal of influence over Hoffman and had a fair availability of time with Meigs. However, because they were senior officers, most of them were commanding regiments that were being mustered into the service. As a result of that, their turnover was huge. So as soon as they realized there was a need for something in their camp, off they went. Because one, they didn't want to be camp commanders. They wanted to get their regiment fully manned and get off to war. This turnover was used very effectively by Hoffman and Meigs not to make improvements. Good example of the turnover at Camp Douglas, Illinois, in the 3.5 years it was in existence, it had 12 command changes, 9 different senior officers in those command changes, not to count 3 command changes of junior officers when there were no prisoners there or few prisoners. The Confederates, on the other hand, had a problem of influence. In addition, they reported directly to General Winder in Richmond, no one in between. And as we mentioned, Winder had a lot of other priorities going. As a result, they got very little support from Richmond. As a matter of fact, Winder had his own problems because he used to fight with the quartermaster general and who was responsible for feeding the prisoners. So these these command differences were significant. It was also, none of them were trained. And of course, the prisoners acted certainly substantially different than a normal soldier. The brigadier general commanding a camp might expect some degree of respect from the prisoners and unfortunately didn't get them. So these commanders were poorly trained or not trained and were certainly given responsibility. You're responsible for them, take care of them. Let's look at the guards. And let's look first at the Union Guard situation. Conscripts were used for mustering in troops early on. A troop would be, a regiment would be mustering in, the camp commander would send a request to a commander of a regiment and say, I need 6 men for guard. Well, these 6 men were provided. They may have had no training. They may have had very little, if any, weapons training, but they were suddenly guards. And their training when they got to do the guard duty was something like, you're a guard, you have a gun, they're the prisoners. If they do something they're not supposed to do, shoot them. That was about the extent of the training. Now, as the troop mustering reduced, as regiments were being filled, local units were assigned as guards. They were many times just local militia who were available, or guards who were there to protect the particular town they were in. They provided some continuity, but also had responsibilities with their units in addition to guarding, and therefore were ill-trained. And in many cases, they were also ill-armed. There were cases of Union guards having weapons that had been condemned. And in a couple of guard situations, the guards on the perimeter were not used their muskets, they were given pistols as their primary weapon. In mid-1863, the Veteran Reserve Corps, and as well as the U.S. colored troops, became commonplace to guard. This improved the continuity of the guards, and it did have some negatives. One, they were still ill-trained, and 2, guards who were bent on being brutal were suddenly going to be there for a longer period of time and could certainly improve their brutality over time. And here's a photograph of the Veterans Reserve Corps soldiers who did help, particularly in the North, in having continuity. Let's look at the South. The South were mostly local militia. There was always pressure on those local militia. They were usually very young or very old. Some disabled troops were used, although the Confederacy never came up with the equivalent of an organized veteran reserve corps. But if there were some troops who couldn't quite make the fight, they could be used as guards. Interestingly, as there was pressure on the Confederacy to move prisoners because of military pressure on from the Union, the guards who often accompanied the prisoners from one camp to another remained in the new camp as guards. Um, Again, none of them were ever trained to be guards. The final factor, which I found one of the most interesting factors, was a failure to provide soldiers with information on how to behave as POWs. This is something you wouldn't think, well, so what? Well, it was interesting because the whole idea of even training your soldiers to do anything but move or shoot was contrary to the military philosophies of the 19th century. You wanted your soldiers to move, you want them to shoot, and really you didn't want them to be burdened with much of anything else. But let's look at an example of where the soldiers themselves helped their own behavior. And Morgan's Raiders is a perfect example of that. Morgan's Raiders were captured in mid-1863, were sent primarily to Camp Douglas in Illinois and Camp Chase in Ohio. And as a matter of fact, the stories relating to them in both those camps are similar. They arrived at those camps in mid-1863, concurrent with Lincoln's suspension of exchange. So they suddenly realized their route out of those camps was death, the war being over, sign the oath of allegiance, or escape. Well, they didn't want to die. They didn't think the war was going to be over very soon. They would refuse to sign the oath of allegiance, so escape was their only out. And escape they did. They tried and successfully and unsuccessfully escaped from these prison camps time after time after time. They harassed the guards. They did everything in their power to make life miserable for the guards. And they supported themselves. For example, as shown here, they had a band. They had an orchestra that played. They had a minstrel show. At Camp Douglas, they published a newspaper with some very interesting news articles. And they supported each other. I did a very unscientific study of the death rate of Morgan's Raiders at Camp Douglas and found that the death rate among Morgan's Raiders was somewhere between 5 and 7% while they were there, compared to roughly 15% in the general population. And if you fast forward to 1955, the Code of Conduct, when it was published, let me just read some of the items in that Code of Conduct. You will resist by any means, make every effort to escape. You will accept neither parole nor special favor. You will keep faith in your fellow prisoners. Everything that Morgan's Raiders did, but without any training to do that. They kept together as a unit as best they could. Let's look at the opposite side, unfortunately, the behavior of some Union soldiers. And let's go to Andersonville. Andersonville had a group of raiders, as they were called, who were Union prisoners who preyed on fellow prisoners. They robbed from them, they stole from them, They displaced them when they had better living conditions than the others. They were known to murder them. It became so serious that the Union soldiers approached Captain Wirtz and asked to hold a trial for a group of these prisoners. Wirtz agreed, and the prisoners themselves held a trial. And as a result of that trial, 6 of the raiders were hanged, as shown in this graphic picture, and roughly 50 others received similar or different punishment, everything from wearing a ball and chain to standing on a barrel to wearing signs. But there were over almost 60 prisoners there who had been preying on other prisoners. The other thing about Andersonville, I mentioned it was an open field, and the Confederacy decided not to lay out how the prison would be function. The prisoners did this. The prisoners put their shebangs wherever they wanted. There were very few streets to move up and down and in and out of the area. There were virtually no place to hold an assembly of soldiers in sufficient quantities to even pass on any information. And as I said, the conditions that the Union prisoners developed were abhorrent and were to their own detriment. So here's 2 examples how a group got together to manage their troops and another who just were totally willy-nilly. You can see these 5 factors had a significant impact on conditions during the war. Now, as I said at the first, they didn't design this kind of presentation to put blame on anyone. There's no blame deserved. It was circumstances. Could have prisoners been taught something? Yes, there was certainly a lot of downtime where you could have taught prisoners, but that was really outside the 19th century military thought. Could the guards have been better trained? Yes, perhaps, but most of those guards had other duties and other responsibilities. The people who were holding the prisoners felt the guards were only there to keep them from escaping. So it's a little hard to blame anyone for any of those conditions. If you're interested in a little more detail on this, my new book out, Military Prisons of the Civil War, Comparative Study, is either available on Camp Douglas Restoration Foundation's website or wherever books are sold. I want to thank you for having the opportunity to provide this information to you, and would be more than happy to try to answer any questions you might have.